Okay, well, welcome everyone to the third of the Suntory Foundation's Japan and Global Context Symposia. And I hope everyone had a good rest and a good breakfast and a good run. And we're very happy to have two distinguished speakers today. Follow our usual format presentation for however long it takes, and then questions and answers. And first guest is Mr. Knightley from the University of British Columbia. Without further ado.
All right, thank you very much.
The floor is yours.
I should mention that I'm quite used to presenting in front of economists. So if anyone does have any questions of clarification or anything like that partway through, I do encourage that. I have a tendency when I get going to just keep on going. So please do interrupt me if there's anything unclear or anything that I can explain more. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be invited to speak with this rather distinguished group. It's very hard to talk about Japanese party politics. I sort of got the agenda of party politics, policy making, leadership. I told all these things, and it's really hard to cover all of that in a single period. And so I was trying to figure out what I thought might be most useful for sort of setting the groundwork for better discussion. Because I don't need to tell a lot of you all about, the Japanese party politics, all these things. Most of you have a fair amount of knowledge. Certainly, we have a speaker later on who is, a well-recognized expert. So what I wanted to do was present to you people have lots of ideas about how party politics have changed, how policymaking and so forth have changed in Japan and over the years. And I wanted to sort of present a couple frameworks for thinking about a whole wide series of changes that might pull them together. So I'm not going to necessarily get into the details of each individual change as much as try and present a framework so people can pull their own ideas together about how policymaking, leadership, party politics have changed in Japan and how party politics influence that. So no framework is in fact sufficient as far as I'm concerned. There are always flaws in any framework. And so I'm going to present two frameworks successively. One's a sort of a policy-making specific targeted framework that I'm going to borrow from Campbell and Shiner. And then the second one is specifically about delegation and accountability in parliamentary democracies, which I'm borrowing from Cloris Strom and colleagues. And then after that, I want to talk a little bit, given these two frameworks, about the challenges of political leadership, in particularly the role of the Prime Minister. I have done a reasonable amount of research on that in the past. So some of the specific lessons that we may have learned or may not have learned, probably should have learned from the DPJ government, 2009-2012, and how that's compared to previous and potentially subsequent administrations, and then sort of end with at least a few minutes on sort of future prospects and what I think is going on. So at one level, these first two topics are in some sense a bit abstract. They are frameworks for thinking about things. They don't necessarily get into the nitty-gritty details as much as we might like. It's really hard to do all the appropriate nitty-gritty details. I recently did an entry for the Oxford Bibliography Online, which was a bilingual entry with one of my graduate students, and it was on Japanese party and electoral politics. Our initial list of things we wanted to include in the bibliography had about 300 items, mostly relatively recently written items. So there's a lot going on, a lot being written in this area, and it's hard to cover it all. But I wanted to sort of, in this talk, lay the groundwork for sort of trying to think about, for frameworks for thinking about how it all matters for policymaking and leadership in Japan. So I'm going to borrow Campbell and Shiner's framework here. And what they provide, this is an article that's in, what is the English journal called? Japan Journal of Political Science, a couple years ago. And it's an article that sort of tries to combine sort of class power, elite, as well as pluralist perspectives on policymaking in Japan. As is typical with these sort of classic approaches to policymaking, have key actors that are bureaucrats, politicians, and interest groups. And what they've done in this sort of thing is they make a number of sort of key distinctions that I think are important to not forget. And that is, how something gets on the agenda is not the same thing as the process by which a policy is necessarily enacted, and then in turn implementation may go through something completely different. And in order to sort of set up that there are multiple different paths to making policy in Japan, they highlight the difference between sort of a general arena of policymaking, and this is a top-level arena in this case. So this is where the political heavyweights sort of get together and talk. And they have various sub-arenas, and these are the, some people refer to these as the iron triangles. That's the old language. We don't necessarily use that language because that has certain implications that people don't necessarily agree with. But there are sub-arenas where specialists work on particular areas. So there are certain politicians who, Zokugin or whatever, who specialize in a certain area, work with certain bureaucracies or whatever, and certain interest groups or others, business groups that may be particularly interested in a certain area. If you have this basic sense of a general top-level policy making arena, which may or may not be sort of well organized, and a large number of sub-arenas, what you end up with is just, as a simple logical step, is 5 different types of policy making. The first is the obvious classical policy making within a single sub-arena. So this is, policy making is being done by the specialists, and it's being decided, and that's where sort of the key action is. And that's one form of policy making. Another one is where an issue or a subject has to cross multiple policy sub-arenas, and the coordination and the interaction is done between these 2 sub-arenas. Okay. That may not necessarily work out always, for any number of reasons. And so oftentimes what you see is, particularly when things are being done within multiple sub-arenas, you see a bottom-up where the higher level may coordinate amongst multiple sub-arenas. You can also see, of course, a top-down policy making where policy initiatives come from the top, and in fact are then, some of the details will be hammered out at lower levels. And then you can have policy making that's done just within the center. So there are these 5, if we accept this sort of Campbell and Shiner framework, which I think has some limits, and I'll get to that in a little bit, you can think these 5 different types of sort of policy-making paths. And in the argument of people who would take this sort of approach is that, in fact, you see all 5 sorts of policy-making in every system, if you can actually identify these sorts of groups. But the balance amongst these different types of policy making may differ, and the sort of which actors are involved, how closed or open the different groups are, may vary quite a bit. What's going on in Japan with some of these things? This is where I sort of get to wave my hand and say, here are a few ideas that Campbell and Shiner and others have made. I don't necessarily agree with all of them. Type 1 policy making. So there is a sense that in terms of within sort of policy-specific areas in Japan, you've seen a change in actors over time. So some would sort of point to the rise and arguably fall of Zokugin, policy specialist politicians. And when I refer to the fall of them, I just mean there are actually fewer of them in this case, arguably, than there were in, say, the 1980s. Part of this has to do with the volatility in the number of politicians, and so you have a lot more inexperienced politicians at the moment. And a second thing that people frequently point out to is that people have argued that there's been a rise in issue complexity, and more issues cross sub-areas. And so, or at least traditionally defined sub-areas. And so with the rise of, be it environmental issues, various globalization-related things, you name it, you have at least a change from a lot of the most important policymaking from being even possible to do in sort of a type 1 process within a single sub-arena, to something that has to be at least type 2 or possibly type 3. Type 2, of course, is where you see coordination at the lower levels across sub-arenas. You still don't have sort of necessarily interaction with higher level. I don't want to make too many claims about this, but certainly traditionally there's been an emphasis on, in many systems, including Japan, on conflict between ministries, conflict between policy areas, and that type 2 policymaking is both important and faces a number of challenges. And typically people point to failure to resolve these type 2 challenges as contributing to an increase in sort of type 3 type policymaking, in which you have stuff bubbling up from the bottom, and sort of a balancing of these things, a redirecting of these things happen at the top. So if you go back to the traditional work on sort of the role of the top political leadership in terms of it being reacting to lower level initiatives from lower level politicians, backbench politicians, specialists, bureaucrats, there's a sense that there's a strong role for sort of bottom-up policymaking in Japan. Arguably, type 4 policymaking, where the initiative comes from the top, has increased in Japan. Some people would argue, certainly. This is certainly an explicit goal of the administrative, the Hashimoto administrative reforms. And if we sort of look at, some basic indicators, there's certainly more resources at the top political levels for advancing and enacting various policies following this. We heard yesterday some talk about this, increasing strength of the Prime Minister's office and the Cabinet office in Canada. There's certainly been an attempt to do something similar in Japan. We could list off any number of major bills that became law, government bills, that were in fact drafted through the initiative of the Cabinet office, through the Prime Minister's office. And also there's a sense, I've argued this in my own research, any number of other people have argued this as well, that there's been a personalization or presidentialization of political leadership and party leadership in Japan, as there's been in many other places in the world. And there's a sense that this is enhanced by changes in the media in Japan. Party leaders, they don't have to necessarily communicate just through NHK News anymore. There are more interesting ways to get to people. And there's also a sense that the changing electoral environment potentially enhances the leaders' power, or at least popular leaders' power. I'll get back to that point in a bit. But there's a sense that a number of people have argued that sort of the space for type 4 policymaking has increased in Japan, although how big that change is certainly something that I think people could reasonably debate. Finally, there's a sense of that there is important politics that goes on without a lot of the lower level bureaucrats, politicians, whomever being involved, and in fact over their objections at times. And certainly if you talk to backbench politicians in political parties who've been elected for just for 1 or 2 terms, they complain about this all the time. The front bench, the party leaders, the faction leaders, the senior politicians ignore us. They don't do what we want. And they negotiate amongst the top level all by themselves. And there's a sense in the broader comparative politics literature, comparative party politics literature, that this is something that becomes greater when you have coalition politics. Because the need for the backbench to delegate to leadership in order to negotiate amongst coalition partners is greater. So that just throw that in the back of your mind. There's not actually a sort of, as far as I know, a lot of systematic work on Japan sort of making arguments about whether there's been an increase or decrease or change. I think there's probably been a change in the content of what's negotiated primarily within the center over time as well. That's probably what it says. Are these trends I've talked about, I've highlighted some of them, common in other parliamentary democracies, developed parliamentary democracies? Almost all of the ones I've mentioned certainly are common. All the ones I've mentioned so far in this talk, I should say, are common. So increased personalization or presidentialization of leaders, rising issue complexity. People talk about this in the literature for many other parliamentary democracies. A sense of coalition politics leading to backbench disaffection. All of these things are things that you run into if you talk about politics in Europe. Now, some political systems have more or less experience with, say, managing coalition politics, but certainly many of these trends I pointed to are things that are common in other countries as well. Let me highlight a few problems I have with this framework. Recall that I mentioned that I'm presenting two frameworks and neither of them are perfect. Remember, this is a framework. This is actually not a theory, right? This is just a framework for looking at changes in policymaking or comparing policymaking between and across countries or over time. It's not actually a proper theory of change in policymaking or a theory about who's influential or powerful. It's neither an empirical theory nor a normative theory. It doesn't say how policymaking should be done, right? And it doesn't actually get at how, say, for example, if the party system changes or party competition changes, how should we necessarily expect that to influence policymaking? You can tease it out, and people can and do tease it out, and I think it's worth doing so. But it's not a full-fledged theory. It's just a framework for thinking about how policymaking processes, it is complex and it goes through, there are multiple pathways. Definitely doesn't get at what sort of motivates the key actors. So the people involved, why are they doing what are they doing? We don't really have a sense of that. And it only hints at what may lead to ineffectual policymaking. Typically people would go from this theory and say, well, ineffectual policymaking happens when there's a mismatch between the appropriate type of policymaking and the actual policymaking, but since there's not actually a proper theory of the match, we're sort of not getting very far. These are a few of the limitations of this sort of framework, but I think it's useful to recognize that policymaking happens in a lot of different ways. And we might be thinking that changes in a party system might enhance certain paths of policymaking and make others harder. And that's something I may get back to in a little bit. Okay, second framework. This is a theory of what parliamentary democracy is, the basic regime, and as contrasted to presidential democracy. This is taken from Horace Strom and colleagues' work on comparing parliamentary democracies in Western Europe. And this is the central reason that we think of parliamentary democracies as being a regime type that's different from presidential is that there is a unitary chain of delegation and accountability. What does that mean? Voters elect their representatives, the politicians from their riding, from their district. Those representatives in turn choose a prime minister and cabinet. And in turn, the prime minister and cabinet delegate certain powers to the head of ministries and in turn civil servants. These are all relationships of delegation. And then accountability relationships go in the opposite direction. Theoretically, lower level bureaucrats are accountable to higher level bureaucrats are accountable to the prime minister and cabinet. The cabinet, through the confidence relationship, is accountable to parliament. And of course, parliament is accountable to the people through general elections. Okay? This is the basic idea of what parliamentary democracy is. Now, as anyone who's ever tried to get somebody to do something for them knows, delegation isn't always easy. Over the years, I've, for example, hired any number of undergraduate research assistants. Sometimes that delegation goes well. Sometimes it doesn't. Similarly, I've voted for any number of politicians, and sometimes they seem to be doing an okay job, and other times I've ended up with some real duds, some lousy politicians representing me. So what is it that makes delegation and accountability work and not work? Well, a lot of this literature on delegation and accountability in parliamentary democracies is inspired by a sort of a rational choice approach, which doesn't necessarily, in this case, assume that people are rational, but does highlight some of the challenges that we can see in delegation and accountability. One of the first major challenges that we see is typically referred to as adverse selection. And in this case, it means simply choosing somebody who's not going to be a very good representative of you, right? Choosing the lousy politician, choosing a bad egg.
Bad
Well,
research assistant.
what's that?
Bad research assistant.
A bad research assistant, somebody who will make up data for me or something, or that's good. Hold on, let me, okay, no, maybe making up data is not necessarily bad. That's moral hazard, I'll get to that. Anyway, so the idea here is you end up picking just a lousy type. The second problem, the second problem is moral hazard. So even if you choose a good type, the situation may tempt that person in ways. So even a good person might be tempted to, I don't know, they bill me for doing 10 hours of research work when I'm not watching them the whole time, and in fact they really only did 8, right? And that temptation, even though they're a good person, that temptation, there's a risk of moral hazards there, that they'll do this. Fundamentally underlying both of these things is the problems are hidden information and hidden action. So these are both informational things, even though they're called information and action. And that is, there is hidden information about the state of the world, potentially, or hidden information about what people are doing. And I don't know what the politicians I've elected are doing the whole time. I don't know the information that they have when they make choices on my behalf. There has to be some sort of trust going on here, and when things go badly, I don't necessarily know how to attribute blame, right? It could have been just, they might have been doing their best and things went badly, or maybe it really is their fault. These sort of attribution challenges are actually pretty challenging and driven in large part by sort of hidden information, hidden action, and an inability to know and who's responsible for what. Now, if you look at, this is not just simply a problem with dealing with politicians, this is a problem dealing with RAs, right? So this is a common challenge in any number of issues in terms of contracting, right? So if you're trying to hire somebody, or if you're going to a doctor and they might decide to do unnecessary tests for you or something like that, and you can't really go against them because they have hidden information because they're specialized. So there are a number of things in the literature that people emphasize to help overcome these challenges to delegation and accountability. These range from having various rules about selection and screening of your choice for your agents, various ways to design contracts, having very clear rules for deselecting people. This is rather important politically, I think. And various institutions set up to try and reveal hidden action and hidden information. We can get into some of the specifics, but what I want to move to on that front is that Strom and his colleagues highlight that there are two broad, within parliamentary democracies, there are two broad types of institutions and mechanisms that manage this potential for what's referred to as agency loss, for agents not doing what the principal wants. One goes through the parliamentary chain of delegation and accountability. And it's something that will strengthen this relationship without external influence. And they emphasize the role of political parties, and this is where I'm eventually getting to political parties, I promise. The other thing, the second type that they do is of institutions and actors that they emphasize are those who are outside the parliamentary chain of delegation and accountability, but influence it in important ways, in ways that in many cases may enhance the effectiveness of the parliamentary chain. Think of things, people would, for example, argue central banks, or the possibility of referendums, direct democracy, a number of these things. In some work that I've done with Masayama Mikitaka, who is now actually half at KO, I don't remember quite the balance, because he still has some affiliation with GRIPS as well, I think, right?
Well, yes.
Yeah, something complicated there. Anyway, Masayama and I, who worked for quite a long time, what we did is we took a look. Strom and his colleagues had a comparison on empirical measures for Western European countries on these two sort of sets of mechanisms for managing parliamentary delegation and accountability. There's the party influence dimension and the external constraints dimension. And Masuyama and I collected a bunch of data on Japan to attempt to have a comparative perspective. What does Japan look like compared to other parliamentary democracies? Sadly, Canada, Strawman and his colleagues didn't do Canada, but I can tell you where Canada fits too if you really want to know. Anyway, for external constraints, they focus on 4 different types. There's international constraints, domestic societal constraints. This is largely having to do with sort of corporatist style arrangements. Domestic subnational constraints on the parliamentary chain. And then there are a range of other national level institutions that might also influence this sort of unitary chain.
How do 2 and 3 differ?
Subnational or subnational governmental, so provinces.
Oh, okay.
If you have federalism or something like that, that constrains the federal government in important ways.
So civil society actors are number 2.
Civil society actors would be number 2, and the emphasis in this, you're going to see all this. So it's civil society. So think of it as sort of civil society versus sort of subnational governmental, and then this is national governmental that aren't part of that unitary chain of parliamentary democracy. Okay.
Watchdogs and so on.
Yeah, central banks that may have some independence, independent judiciary, perhaps. There are any number of those things. In terms of this international dimension, in Europe, the focus is obviously on the EU. And so in trying to capture this empirically, they use measures of sort of, essentially the size of a country in Europe, because the argument is it's actually based on their voting weight in the council. But the argument is that the larger countries are somewhat less constrained and more influential in the EU, whereas the smaller countries kind of have to go along with it. What are the sort of major international constraints on Japan in terms of what the Japanese government can do? It's an interesting question. I've actually done other work on sort of how the broader international economic conditions can constrain government economic decision making. There's a whole range of things that we can think of. But the truth of the matter is, if you look at the broader comparative literature, Japan, at least on the economic front, would generally be seen as being far less constrained than a typical country. It's large, it has relatively few neighbors. Many people would argue, at least the security front is slightly different, but on most fronts, compared to, I don't know, Denmark or Iceland or, small European countries, Japan is not constrained much in a comparative sense. We can talk about that. I think that's an interesting one to discuss. In terms of domestic societal constraints, the emphasis in this literature has typically been on the idea that governments in a more pluralist system, a pluralist organization of civil society interests and interest groups, our governments are less constrained, but if you have sort of rigid corporatist style peak associations, bargaining amongst the peak associations, governments are more constrained. Japan falls on the less corporatist side by most measures, but it certainly has certain key corporatist elements. In terms of domestic subnational, Japan, of course, is not a federal system, unlike Germany or Belgium at this point, or something like that. But it's interesting to note that, and probably most people in this audience do know this, the proportion of government final consumption, the amount of money that governments have that's actually spent by the local governments in Japan is really high compared to most countries. And so a lot of the sort of cross-national comparison literature when looking at the power of local governments look at how much they spend relative to other things. And so by that measure, that's the only measure, and I'll show you the numbers in just a little bit, by which the Japanese government is seen as having a sort of strong constraint. Needless to say, obviously Japan is it is not a federal system, it is unitary. So I think relying solely on these consumption numbers is somewhat misleading. But it is interesting to note. In terms of the national institutions, we can think of the parliamentary chain of delegation being influenced by a range of national institutions, including a head of state. So if you look, France is a parliamentary system. I know that sounds weird to people. There is a clear parliamentary chain of delegation accountability, but there's also an independently elected powerful head of state. And that massively constrains the sort of parliamentary chain of delegation and accountability in France. Other places there may not be a president as powerful as in France, but there may be a head of state who has some power. Japan, not so much. The head of state is not really constrained on the parliamentary system, on the parliamentary chain of delegation. Central bank, the Japanese central bank is quite weak. I should say, weak is the wrong word here. It is not all that independent by most of the measures of central bank independence. That's not to say it is not influential, but it is most of the attempts to understand central bank independence and their would suggest that the Japanese one is not particularly independent. Judiciaries, we can talk about very strong judiciaries that have that play major constraints on political systems. This is Germany again, or the U.S. Some have argued Canada would be very strong in this dimension as well. Japan, there is independent judicial review, unlike a few countries. However, the judiciary is there's a strong partisan influence on who gets appointed and arguably on how judges get promoted. And certainly the court has been pretty restrained for the most part in political rooms. Direct democracy in some systems, you think Switzerland, but there are other countries as well. Direct democracy, the opportunity for citizens to have referendums, is a key constraint on what the parliamentary system can do. Japan, obviously, referendums will only require constitutional amendments and, well, the reappointment of Supreme Court judges, but that's so far not been important. Here's how Japan looks if we try to actually measure this. In terms of international constraints, would be these are all normalized with the weakest European country is 0, the strongest in terms of the country that has the weakest constraint being 0, the one that's most constrained being a 1. Japan would actually be a 0 on international constraints by these measures. It would be no more constrained than the UK or Italy. Norway is, and Iceland are not EU members, so that's why they're also zeros.
Why do France and Germany get zeros?
Because they're the, it's normalized. It's not that there's no international constraint. It's that they have the least international constraint among the 17 European countries. They have equal, and the measure they use here is actually the voting power in the EU Council, and so the Germany, France, the UK have the equal voting power. I tried to get them to use a different measure. They didn't listen to me. Anyway, in terms of fiscal decentralization, Japan's actually quite decentralized. In fact, more so than any other European country except Germany. However, if you were to actually replace this with a measurement of sort of that looks at federalism and the actual reserved powers of subnational governments, Japan would be, in fact, much lower than it actually is. In terms of the standard measures of corporatism, Japan comes in as slightly, but not very corporatist. So, more corporatist than the UK or Spain, but much less corporatist than a country like the Netherlands or Norway. Head of state, no constraints. Central bank, almost the weakest central bank in the group. In fact, it's effectively indistinguishable by these measures. Relatively weak judiciary, almost no sort of requirements for direct democracy, and overall, Japan has the second lowest external constraints compared on this list of 17 other countries. Only the UK has fewer external constraints on what that core parliamentary chain of delegation and accountability can do. Which is interesting because we don't necessarily think of, Japan as being more Westminster-like, having an than many of these countries. But in many ways, it is in terms of the extent to which there are external constraints. Now, particularly in systems in which you have relatively few external constraints, that means that the partisan dimension becomes far more important. And partisan influence, from his colleagues, attempt to measure this on two main levels. The partisan influence in the electorate and in elections, and then partisan influence within government. In the aggregate indicators, the actual possibility of parties enhancing delegation and accountability in Japan is actually relatively strong, which really is surprising. I would argue that this is actually, it's not simply surprising, it's misleading. And I'll get to why this is in just a little bit. But in terms of these broader indicators, let me just throw out what Strongman's colleagues use. In terms of looking at the party and the electorate, they look at sort of the mass organization parties, arguing that mass mobilized parties have the opportunity for greater representation of sort of citizens with their parties. Mass organization, mass mobilization in Japan's party membership is quite low in Japan comparatively. Certainly quite low now, and even if you go in the past, it's actually been comparatively low. Obviously, the odd exceptions of when you had 1979, 1980 with the LDP party primary, the leadership primaries, odd exception. But anyway, party identification in Japan used to be comparatively high. If you go back to the 1960s, the number of citizens who actually identify clearly and strongly with the party. Now, Japan is exceptionally low. There was talk yesterday that the largest group of in Canada is now non-identifiers. That's been true in Japan since 1978, something like that. Certainly since the late 70s. And it's been a solid majority of Japanese citizens for the last 10 or 15 years. There's an argument that having parties that are continually represented in parliament but never in government inhibits the representation of people's voices and citizens' interests. This used to be, the seat share of parties that had really never been in government in Japan used to be quite high. 2009 happened, it suddenly became very low. It's gone back up again, if you take a look at, obviously we have all these new parties. But this is one of the things that has changed a lot over time in Japan. And with the fluidity of party system in recent years, this is one of the areas that's quite interesting, the extent to which voters, their elected representatives are actually getting not just in the parliament, but into government as well. The other thing that's important to note is that in terms of enhancing accountability, we want to understand, are governing parties treated the same way? Are they jointly held accountable for what they're doing? If parties are treated, governing parties are not treated the same way, if they're not held accountable in the same way for what they're jointly responsible for, there's potentially a weakness in terms of the accountability mechanism here. And in Japan, in part because there have been so many single-party cabinets, there have actually been relatively few cases where voters, relatively few cases until recently, I should say, that relatively few cases in which voters have rewarded one governing party and punished the other. This has obviously become more common in the last 10, 15 years, however. In terms of partisan influence cabinet, again, there's an interest in arguing that single-party majority cabinets are more likely to have clear party influence in cabinet. But if there are coalition systems, if coalition discipline is high, the opportunity to understand who is accountable for what is higher, arguably. And similarly, if there's relatively low partisan conflict in government, if it's easier for voters to simply say, well, I can just evaluate the government and hold them accountable and not try and get into the messiness of figuring out which coalition partner was meaner to which, right? And there's also the issue of partisan influence in appointments in the bureaucracy and in other areas in government. And that's a messy category that we can return to at some point. If we attempt to measure all these things, Japan does what I would argue surprisingly well. But one of the striking things is how, particularly compared to the external constraints, where almost every measure was quite low, it's hugely variable in terms of the role of parties, the strength of parties, the potential for parties to enhance delegation and accountability. So, party identification is low, arguably partisan influence is low, Seat share in non-governing parties has gone down and up and down and up. It's changed dramatically over time. But a reasonable number of, the majority of measures, Japan scores relatively high compared to many of the European systems here. So again, cabinets are usually, it's pretty common for cabinets to be majority. There's quite high coalition discipline in terms of voting in parliament. There's, oddly enough, in terms of the specific measure being used, there's relatively low levels of conflict between coalition partners in Japan. When you aggregate up all of these, this actually gives an overall picture, if you want to believe it, that the potential for parties to manage this, partisan chain of delegation and accountability is actually reasonably high. And if we look at the sort of a two-dimensional mapping of these two, of the external constraints versus the potential for partisan influence, Japan looks, quite low on the external constraints, but reasonably high on the partisan influence. So it's not quite the extreme case of the United Kingdom, which has quite high potential for parties to have influence and have clear delegation and accountability. But short of that, it's in the upper left quadrant, which would suggest a more Westminster-style system in which the parliamentary chain of delegation and accountability is not particularly constrained by other actors. And the potential for parties to enhance delegation and accountability is reasonably high. Now, this picture contrasts a bit with the broader sense that I think many of us have, that things are really dysfunctional in Japan. Party politics, there are a huge number of problems. So what's going on here? What's going on here? I mean, let's get to this. I mean, again, in the aggregate, the patterns of Japanese delegation accountability fits well within this mapping, and it looks, reasonably, I hate to use the word normal, but normal. What the Japanese case to me highlights is some problems with not just this framework, but with the indicators being used here. Okay? These cross-national indicators were, in many ways, used because measures were available. This is the bane of cross-national comparison of this sort. Measures were available, and so that's what we had to use. The intra-party dimension is entirely missing, right? So the cohesiveness of political parties, hugely important for the extent to which parties can effectively manage delegation and accountability, not measured at all, not considered at all. Sort of hands waved at one point in a footnote, I think. So that's important. The issue of bicameralism almost completely ignored. Anyone who's been following Japanese politics for, I don't know, it takes almost no time. In recent years, certainly knows the challenges that can be associated with what's the English? English would be twisted parliament, right? I can start listing a host of other issues, but one of the key things here in thinking about the underlying both normative and empirical theory associated with this sort of approach is that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. This is actually true. This is not just a truism. There's actually a strong theoretic reason for believing that this. And so, to the extent that Japan or other countries, there are certain stages in which sort of the delegation or accountability is failing, the whole system may be dysfunctional. You actually have to get every stage in that process to work to have an effective parliamentary democracy that doesn't have massive amounts of agency loss. Okay. So again, as I said before, basically the chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and certainly, given that Japan, and I think quite rightly on these measures, comes across as a system in which the external constraints don't really bind the core parliamentary system here. Chaos in the party system really can substantially weaken the extent to which policy making reflects the will of citizens, which is the sort of core tenet of this approach, this framework to understanding parliamentary democracy. Okay? All right, I've given you two frameworks. As I said, I think both of these are flawed, but I think both of these are interesting to talk about and to think and provide some lens of both sort of thinking about change over time in Japan, as well as comparing Japan policymaking and party politics to other parliamentary democracies. I want to talk a bit about political leadership and particularly the role of the Japanese Prime Minister. This is where a reasonable amount of my previous research has been, and I just find this a really important and fun topic, particularly in recent years. I think this is the 6th time I've given a talk over the last 5 years that has had a reasonable amount of content about the Japanese Prime Minister, and for every talk until now, I've had a new Prime Minister to talk about. This time I also have a new Prime Minister to talk about, but it's the same one as when I gave this talk. I gave a talk on the Prime Minister 5 years ago. So it's like, wow, I can actually borrow the same pictures. It's changed. All right, but here's the quiz for the room. Can you name any other country where there have been 4 straight Prime Ministers that did not last even a year in office? And this happened the last 3 LDP Prime Ministers. Abe, Aso, Fukuda, and then the first DPJ Prime Minister in 2009. 4 in a row in Japan. Can anyone else come up with one? Any country.
Is there one?
Yes, actually.
Italy?
What's that?
Italy.
This is the most common guess, and it's actually never happened in Italy, although there are places, it's close.
Greece.
Greece. You would think so, given how crazy it's been there, but no. Now, so in one room when I asked this question, people were like, well, there were 4 presidents in a row in Argentina, some of which lasted 3 days, but during the financial crisis in Argentina. But that doesn't actually, little different, and the 4th one lasted more than a year.
Andorra.
Honestly, I don't have data on Andorra. If you know something about Andorra that I don't, I'm in awe. Okay, there actually is one, and it's Denmark, but in the 1950s. And what you had actually there were some, as you've seen in Greece recently, you had some technocrat prime ministers who took over for a couple months as well. So even that's not really comparable, because in the Japanese case, these are all actually partisan prime ministers. As far as I know, this may change in another 7 months. There's been no other, at least developed parliamentary democracy since World War II, that has had 7 straight prime ministers who have not lasted 1.5 years. If Abe this time around lasts more than 1.5 years, that'll break that streak. What's going on here? This is, Japanese prime ministers traditionally not lasted very long in office, at least not since the 1970s. This is pretty extreme though, right? I always like to get my Japan is #1 slide in. Japan is #1 in something. Japan's #1 in many things, but Japan is #1 politically in a number of post-war prime ministers. With Abe in his first administration, Japan passed Italy in terms of the number of different post-war prime ministers, and the gap has only grown since then. It's actually striking. The current Prime Minister of Luxembourg has been Prime Minister since 1995. Can anyone even count that high as to how many Prime Ministers we've had in Japan since 1995? It's a lot, right? So this is pretty extreme. Now, what's actually quite striking, here's just a mark for every change in Prime Minister across sort of the 2021 developed parliamentary democracies. Japan's on top, Italy, I'm sorry, it was Finland. I'm sorry, did I say Denmark earlier?
Yeah.
It's Finland. Finland. And so what's interesting if you look at this pattern over time is there are some countries like Italy and Finland which have had a reasonable number.
Why do you miss France?
This is only France 5, not France 4. France should be in
France 4 is a very frequent change.
Yeah, so I only have, you're right, France 4, it was quite frequent.
Only eight months.
Yeah, no, there were definitely some, you're right, I should include France 4 in there, you're absolutely right. That would be smart, thank you. That's a very reasonable point. But what I was going to say is, France 4, of course, early post-war. High turnover in Finland, early post-war. Italy, much higher turnover, not immediately post-war, but in the 50s and 60s compared to the 90s and 2000s. Japan is the only country in this set where the pattern's reversed. The early post-war, Japan falls smack dab in the middle in terms of prime minister durability. starting in the 70s, you start seeing the replacement of most prime ministers every 2 years. And then in the last, 8 years, you have this sort of, if a prime minister lasts a year, you should be impressed, pattern. So it's actually relatively an unusual pattern that durability has gone down, okay? In fact, if you look more broadly, the period from 2000 to 2010 had the highest prime ministerial durability in the post-war period for, across developed parliamentary democracies. Japan is a massive outlier. Okay? What's going on in Japan? What's going on in Japan is, and this may seem obvious to people in the room, but you're getting the prime minister replaced without the governing parties changing. This is unusual. Recent Australian politics notwithstanding, it's extraordinarily unusual. You see it occasionally in Italy, which is the closest comparison, as people guessed. A little bit in Belgium, but really you have this at least twice as often, if not more, in Japan than anywhere else. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that the reasons that this has happened has changed over time. Okay? The changes that we saw in prime minister in the 1970s and 80s happened for different reasons than we're seeing currently. Okay? Really, we could actually break this down into a lot of different periods. We talk about change in the prime minister or lack thereof, and in some cases during the immediate post-war period. We can talk about the period of longest prime ministerial durability in the early LDP years. We can then talk about sort of the institutionalized era of LDP, where you had the regular, Nakasone aside, regular rotation of the prime minister. Then we have an interesting transition period in the 90s. And then you have what I would suggest is a very clear, clear personalized prime minister. And the turnover of prime ministers is pretty clearly tied to issues of popularity primarily, whereas it was not tied to that before. Okay? Now, when I give a talk like this to a crowd that doesn't know Japanese politics, I always have to explain, back in the day, long, long ago, people didn't know who the Japanese prime minister was. It's a little extreme. I mean, people knew who he was, but the prime minister wasn't seen as all that important. It was there. One of the striking things is that compared to most other systems where the head of government has a substantial honeymoon period, Japanese prime minister never used to have a honeymoon in terms of popularity. It's really striking. So, Ikeda, this is the first, just the first 2.5 years. No honeymoon, right? Sato, no honeymoon. Tanaka, honeymoon, very exceptional. We can talk about Tanaka. Tanaka's a very important exception. Honeymoon, very clear honeymoon, had popularity, dropped massively in the first year. Very striking, very different from what had come before. But Tanaka's the exception. After this, it just goes back. Miki, not really a honeymoon. A slight decline. Fukuda, absolutely no trend. Ohira, no trend. Suzuki, well, downward trend, but it's not the first year. There's almost no change in the first year. Nakasone, no trend. If anything, it goes up over time, right? Takeshita, but there's no trend in the first year. There's no honeymoon per se. Most honeymoons for heads of government are typically the first 3 or 4 months. Or the first 6 months, maybe, depending on the system. So, no honeymoon, just a really bad second year, right? I mean, it's Takeshita. Uno. No honeymoon. No honeymoon. Yes, exactly. No honeymoon for any number of reasons.
He had a honey.
That's exactly right. No honeymoon, but very clearly a honey. Yes, I should use that line for sure. I like that. Uno, no honeymoon. Kaifu, no honeymoon. Miyazawa, honeymoon. Oddly enough, strange. But again, this is we're now what 13 prime ministers in, and this is the second that has had a honeymoon.
So what do you define as a honeymoon then?
Honeymoon is start relatively high, and 50 is relatively high, and then it drops.
You call that a honeymoon?
Yes, in the literature here, it's artificially high popularity to start out a cabinet that then drops.
But it's supposed to linger a while.
Linger for 3 or 4 months. That's how long in the comparative literature honeymoons typically last.
So your x-axis here is months?
Yeah, so the x-axis here is months in all. So this is
That's
just
not
this.
a honeymoon because he drops like a rock right away.
You're right. If anything, you're right. It doesn't last. But the fact that it starts high and goes down is very different than what comes before, right? Everyone else, it doesn't really change. It doesn't start high, it doesn't start low. There's a baseline and it just sort of meanders around it. This is different, as was Tanaka. And as we'll see, the prime ministers after Oguchi have been different as well, okay?
Hatsuyama and Khan had some big honeymoon at
Yeah.
first few months,
Yeah.
like 70%.
Right.
They were just very good at decreasing their.
Yeah, I was going to say, or you could say, arguably, some people would say, well, they started at a very high level. It's not that they had a honeymoon.
Like,
It's not that there was honeymoon. They had a base level that was very high that they then proved that they were really bad at. But these dynamics are different, is what I want to highlight. Whether we sort of use the same terminology or not, these dynamics are very different. So Miyazawa, different. Sort of the first one since Tanaka that really has a quite different pattern. Hosokawa, you get this hint that if it had lasted longer, it would also have this pattern. Not, obviously it only lasted 8 months, but you have the sense that it might have gone that way. Hatha, again, too short. We don't know what would have happened. Murayama, absolutely nothing. Hashimoto, absolutely nothing. Just broad, meandering. Obuchi, actually the opposite, starts low, goes up. This is unusual. Comparatively, it's unusual. Historically in Japan, it's unusual. Comparatively, the closest comparison is probably Nakasone in terms of these dynamics, but it's still, Obuchi's more extreme in the sort of sense, starting much lower than Nakasone did. And it's after Obuchi that we start seeing a fairly consistent pattern. Within the first 6 months, frequently within the first 3 months, a drop of 20 points or more. The only ones that had that before were Miyazawa and Tanaka. That you had a drop of 20 points in the first year, by the end of the first year. Sometimes it's a little earlier, sometimes a little later. Every prime minister, with the exception of the current incarnation of Abe, has had a drop of 20 points or more in popularity within the first year. Whereas it was almost unheard of before now. So you take a look, you get even Koizumi, massively popular. By the end of his first year, he had dropped 40 points in popularity, right? There was definitely sort of a honeymoon and then a drop, right? He did things that increased his popularity again later, but there was a massive drop in popularity his first year. Abe dropped 30 points. Kakuda dropped almost 30 points. Also, you didn't even think it was possible, and he dropped almost 30 points. If you look at the 1960s and 70s, with the exception of Tanaka, this is just horizontal lines in terms of the popularity trends. They may start at slightly higher, slightly lower, but these are effectively horizontal lines, except for Tanaka. In the 2000s, it's very clear everybody's dropping in the first year. And we can, typically, starting high and getting low, however fast it happens, is referred to as a honeymoon, but it's strikingly different. Okay? The DPJ, the Minchito's prime ministers, all have had this decline as well. Hatoyama. Khan's exceptional. I don't know if any of you remember what happened here. This was the Ozawa, the primary, the party presidency challenge. So there was started high, dropped. Khan beat Ozawa in the party presidential contest, went back up, and then dropped again. But again, even within the first year, you've got a 40-point decline. And similarly, Noda going from above 50 to just barely above 20 within the first year. So we have what are typical, prime ministers have relatively high popularity, and then they somehow, at least the popular perception, somehow they screw it up. I'm not certain that that's the best way to think of it necessarily, but it is a strikingly different dynamic. And the recent turnover in the Japanese prime minister is both unusual comparatively, and it seems to be tied to popularity. Once the reason for this is, if you look at the elections in Japan, the popularity of the party matters so much more than it used to, right? We can talk about this in more detail in a little bit. I'm going to try and wrap up in 5-7 minutes. But so it's not simply that the dynamics of the popularity of the prime minister have changed. They actually matter to rank and file politicians a lot more than they used to. You know, the national swing tied to the popularity of parties, amongst other things, is quite high. And so what this means is that popular prime ministers have a lot more leverage than they used to. And unpopular prime ministers, well, they're just not going to last. And so this is pretty striking. You know, more broadly speaking in the literature, I think there's a tendency to overestimate the importance of these idiosyncratic factors. But you know, we've had 9 straight prime ministers who've all had this pattern that was pretty unusual beforehand. So there's something more systematic going on. We don't just have a exceptionally bad crop of prime ministers. It's not. It's too systematic a difference for me to believe that it's just idiosyncratic factors about the personal leadership of these prime ministers. Okay. One possible argument is that there's a sense amongst people that the prime minister's role has changed. We can think about the Hashimoto administrative reforms, the whole push towards political leadership is more important. And so the expectations of voters have changed. This might also be enhanced by the changes in the electoral rules. People can argue this either way. But what I would argue we're seeing in Japan, at least when it comes to the the role of prime minister, is something like hyper accountability. Prime ministers need to keep their support numbers up in the relatively short term, because otherwise they're going to get sacked. Okay, and this leads to something of a I would argue, a more short-term focus. Now, for what it's worth, I will take hyper accountability over no accountability. So if the trade-off is between hyper accountability and no accountability, I'll take hyper accountability. But there are definitely a number of downsides to this. Indeed, shorter time horizons of actors. If a prime minister thinks that unless I keep everybody super happy, I'm going to be out of office in 1 year, that's very different from prime ministers who have the ability to stay, the expectations that they'll stay in office for 3, 4, 5, 10 years. It makes, to the extent that popularity is seen as increasingly important, it makes enacting costly policy change more difficult. And it also, lots of turnover at the top makes oversight of the bureaucracy more complicated. So these are 3 potential key consequences of this. I'm somewhat optimistic about Abe, by the way, that at least I'm expecting him to last more than a year this time. He didn't last time. But I'll get to that in just a moment. Okay, I'm going to sort of skim. People are generally fairly familiar with recent politics, so I just want to sort of highlight a few quick things here. I'm going to skip a few slides. 1993-2009, we saw a pretty fractured and fluid party system, and over time it seemed to be gradually stabilized towards pretty clear LDP-DPJ competition. That's what it seemed like up through 2009. 2009 to now has undermined this pattern. Okay, so this is the broad contours here. This is the effective number of candidates in each single member district in House of Representatives elections. More candidates. If votes are widely distributed amongst a lot of candidates over here, if you have two main candidates, it's all being lined up here. By 2009, there was a strong tendency for 80% of districts to have very clear two-party competition. And what you see over time is exactly what somebody like Steve Reed was expecting. Steve wasn't necessarily expecting 2013, no. But the sense that we've moved in single-member districts, to something looking like Duverger's law, arguably. 2013 actually looks a lot like, not 1996, but 2000 in terms of the spread of votes. So it's as if Japan, in terms of consolidation of two-party competition in the districts, has gone back to this period back to 2000. Canada also looks roughly like Japan in 2000. And Canada has looked like that since 1993, more or less. National swings, we all pretty familiar with this. Massive LDP landslide, massive DPJ landslide, massive LDP landslide. This is also, we can think about this as being anti-incumbent. 2005, the LDP ran against itself. or Koizumi ran against the LDP, leading to a massive LDP landslide. So it is actually the odd, government winning means anti-incumbent. I know but fortunately this audience gets that. Again, anti-incumbent sentiment pretty strong. In terms of policy making, however, and I think that there is a tendency, I would argue, for people to think, oh, the DPJ was absolutely lousy, and forget that, in fact, most people thought the LDP was particularly lousy at policy making for 2006 to 2009 also. Okay? 2006 to 2009, the LDP, complaints about the LDP were a lot like the complaints about the DPJ in the next 3 years. They weren't getting things done. There was a lot of the conflict between backbench and frontbench party members. People were worried about party splits in this period. There was a real sense in 2008, 2009, that the LDP was a sinking ship. There was a real worry about this. So in terms of policymaking, I actually see a lot of similarities in these two periods. In terms of the elections, I think 2009 and 2012, there's some pretty distinct similarities. Anti-incumbent sentiment, challenges to party unity, although obviously the DPJ had a major split and the LDP did not. And of course, prime ministerial turnover and unpopularity continued. 2012, major differences though. We see a clear sign of voter dissatisfaction. 10 million fewer people voted in 2012 than in 2009. We see the rise of these third force parties. We can debate the English here, and there's a sense that this version of Abe is going for different governance strategies, and I'll conclude with that one in just a moment. But let me just sort of skip this. In terms of the challenges to party unity, I'm just going to do a quick plug. We've just published a book on the 2012 election. This is edited by Steve Reed, Ethan Shiner, Robert Pekkanen. There are a lot of great people, sort of half based in Japan, half not based in Japan. Just come out by Routledge. I have a chapter in it on party unity in Japan, and specifically examining the DPJ split. And I really think that if the LDP were in a similar situation in 2009, you would have seen a split as well. The important thing to realize is that parties are held together because they further the ambitions of politicians. When parties don't further the ambitions of politicians, and here's the key thing, and another viable option appears, you should expect splits and challenges to party unity. In 2012, there was a very clear option to a reasonable number of DPJ politicians, and that was split and become a part of a third party. That was viable. For the LDP, the sinking ship of the LDP in 2008, 2009, that wasn't viable because there wasn't this splinter of the opposition. All the votes were clearly going to go to the DPJ. So there was no reason for the backbenchers who knew they were going to lose. In 2008, 2009, they knew they were not going to win their seat if they stayed in the LDP. But there's no reason for them to leave because there's no alternative place for them to go because those votes were going to the DPJ. Okay? Quick note, there's a curse associated with winning big. Anybody who's used to conservative governments in Canada actually knows this, thinking about the 1980s and so forth. Party unity and getting things done, it's actually really hard when you win a landslide. And the reason for this is backbench politicians don't expect the landslide to continue. So those most vulnerable ones who are swept in a landslide are very worried about their future. And so you have to work hard to keep them together and to make sure that they're going to stick with you because they're looking over their shoulder the whole time, knowing that the pendulum's going to swing the other way soon. Voter disaffection, I mean, it's 2009 to 2012. This is extreme. What happened in 2012 was not a resurgence of the LDP. I mean, I think this room knows this. It was a massive decline, collapse of the DPJ. 20 million fewer votes. 20 million fewer votes. And of those, 10 million were people who stayed home in the election, and 10 million went to these new parties. Okay, just a quick on the future. So Abe is back as prime minister. Some have suggested, I made this argument in January that Abe's big plan is to not repeat history. That was Abe's big plan, was to not repeat what happened last time he was prime minister in 2007, 2008. And he was going to work very hard to win the 2013 election. Now, obviously, I think the opposition helped him out here some. But in that sense, Abe has been far more successful already this time around than he was previously because of the 2013 election. House of Councilors election. What's more interesting to me is that so far, obvious polling numbers have defied the recent patterns. We have not seen the same drop that we've typically seen so far. We're 8 months in. But I still believe that obvious is facing a number of these similar challenges that previous leaders faced. The nature of political problems, economic problems facing China has not gotten any easier. If anything, it's getting worse. He has a largely inexperienced, vulnerable backbench. The rank and file LDP members are new and junior and nervous. And he faces a very volatile electoral arena. That being said, he has some advantages that almost nobody has seen recently, which is that he does not have a diet that's nearly as twisted as it was for most of the last 15 years. He has, and to me this is key, he has 3 full years now until he faces another national election. And this mitigates a lot of these worries about hyper-accountability, because the threat of electoral punishment is far more distant. And of course, he has some more experience than most leaders have had recently. So I think there are some chances that things will go well. But these fundamental challenges, party system instability, disenchantment of the voters, and sort of these difficulty of tough policy choices when politicians are vulnerable still remain. One of the things that I think links back to sort of the discussion last night about Canadian politics is that there's a clear incentive in the Japanese electoral system for sort of two-party competition at the district level. But there's not necessarily a clear mapping of what, it's not very clear what the major cleavages here that would be represented. The parties don't map onto any clear cleavage structure that matches well. So when we have gotten a move towards sort of solid two-party competition in 2009, when the parties become when the voters become disaffected with those two options, they'll turn to something else because they're not strongly tied to the sort of anchored by ideological or policy cleavages that map them to their parties. So this disenchantment of voters with the two parties provides a mobilization opportunity, which in Canada, also in Japan, I would argue, is frequently, it's easier to do this regionally or in specific geographic areas because of single-member districts. And in general, we still face the problem of making tough policy choices when politicians are politically vulnerable. So these are some of the sort of general points that I've tried to raise in this talk, but I look forward to hopefully a long and fruitful discussion, your thoughts, and of course the talk this afternoon as well. So.
Thank you, Ben. Well, that's very rich. We have a lot to talk about, but perhaps people would like to grab a cup of coffee or
That's a great idea.
visit the washroom. So why don't we take a 5-minute break to reload, and then we'll come back.